What historical fact makes you cry? Teddy Roosevelt's mother Mitty and his wife Alice, who had just given birth days before, both died in the same house on the same day, hours apart from each other. In his diary entry that day, he drew a large black X and scribbled, "The light has gone out of my life." That's some heavy it right there, man. When Alexander Hamilton's eldest son died, his second child Angelica Hamilton had a mental breakdown and she never recovered. Sometimes, her family would walk into a room with only her in it, and she would be speaking to her dead brother. Christmas Day, 1914. German and British soldiers got up from their trenches and called a 48-hour truce to just chill and even play soccer. This makes me cry because it shows that the soldiers of both sides really found it pointless to fight other people just cause their country said so. This is probably the strongest story of unity I've heard about in history class. In World War II, an American pilot named Charles Brown was flying a B-17 in a bomb raid over Germany where his aircraft was severely shot up and entered a free fall when Brown passed out. When Brown awoke, he was only a few thousand feet above the ground and barely was able to recover the aircraft. When the Luftwaffe spotted a limping B-17 far below the formation, they dispatched a pilot named Franz Stigler, a soon-to-be ace just one kill away, with 2 downed B-17s earlier that day. As he approached from the rear, Stigler noticed that the B-17's tail gunner didn't move and after further inspection, realized he and several other gunners were dead. Stigler saw this and remembered what his flight instructor had said years ago. "If you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." Stigler saw this limping B-17 as no different from a downed pilot in a parachute. To prevent German flak cannons from taking it out, Stigler flew in formation with the B-17 all the way until the English Channel where it landed safely. Stigler never mentioned the incident, and cold being court-martialed for it. Decades later, Charles went looking for the enemy pilot that saved his life that fateful day, and eventually met him face to face, becoming close friends and dying just a few months apart from each other in 2008. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The doors to the exit and the stairwells were locked, so you either had to jump out the window or be burned alive. The story of Alex, 1977 to 2007. An African grey parrot who learned to speak, recognize objects and play with his owner. It was one of the smartest parrots ever reported. He loved his owner and his owner adored him as well. In the end, he suffered arteriosclerosis, so his owner went to see him one last time. To which Alex told his owner, "You are good. I love you." She replied, "I love you too." He said, "I'll see you tomorrow," and she replied, "Yes, I'll see you tomorrow." World War I mercy dogs. They would go out into no man's land and find wounded soldiers. They would bring medical supplies for the soldiers to patch themselves up, or if the soldier was too mortally wounded, stay and comfort them in their final moments. The story of Joe Aridi. Joe was tested and found to have an IQ of 46 and the mind of a 6-year-old. Despite this, Joe Aridi was executed at the age of 23 by the state of Colorado. In addition, Joe was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted and the victim of a coerced confession. Joe's mental challenges were so significant that he didn't even understand he was about to die as they walked him to the gas chamber, more than while held on death row during the appeals process. Aridi often played with a toy train. 9. Given to him by prison warden Roy Best. The warden said that Aridi was the happiest prisoner on death row. 7. He was liked by both the prisoners and guards. Best became one of Aridi's supporters and joined the effort to save his life. 6. He said of Aridi before his execution, he probably didn't even know he was about to die. All he did was happily sit and play with a toy train I had given him. 1. More than for his last meal, Aridi requested ice cream. When questioned about his impending execution, he showed blank bewilderment. 7. He did not understand the meaning of the gas chamber, telling the warden no, Joe won't die. 10. He was reported to have smiled while being taken to the gas chamber, momentarily nervous. He calmed down when the warden grabbed his hand and reassured him. 7. 11. Whenever I think about him smiling and walking to his death, it makes me ducking ill. I'm deeply ashamed of the system of governance that allowed it to happen, even 80 years removed from it. More than this soldier, I realized, must have had friends at home and in his regiment, yet he lay there deserted by all except his dog. I looked on, unmoved, at battles which decided the future of nations. Tearless, I had given orders which brought death to thousands, yet here I was stirred, profoundly stirred to tears. And by what? By the grief of one dog, Napoleon Bonaparte. On finding a dog beside the body of his dead master, licking his face and howling, on a moonlit field after a battle, Napoleon was haunted by this scene until his own death. There were approximately 300 infants and children that were murdered in Jonestown, being forcibly fed or injected with cyanide. I feel so much pain for all the victims, but the kids in particular make me ache with despair. Henry Gunter was an American soldier killed during World War I at 10:59 am on the 11th of November, 1918, 1 minute before the armistice took effect at 11 am. Gunter charged a German roadblock outfitted with machine guns. German soldiers tried waving him off, knowing the war would come to an end in mere moments. Apparently he got too close, fired a couple rounds, and was promptly shot and killed instantly. Most if not all the astronauts aboard the Challenger survived the explosion. It was the crash into the water that would have killed them. The Sand Creek Massacre is particularly bad. They had so much faith in the peace treaties that had been signed, the signs of good faith from American settlers, only to be massacred. The leader of the camp, Black Kettle, desperately holding up the American flag he'd been given with a white flag underneath it, encouraging his people to gather around it, thinking that the settlers would realize they were allies and stop the killings, only to be shot down. The descriptions of the massacre are brutal: children tortured and slaughtered, pregnant women with their children torn out of their stomachs, genitals torn from corpses and taken for trophies. It really made me realize you can never underestimate the cruelty of mankind, especially considering most of the murdered in this massacre were defenseless women, children, and elderly. Breakup of the Kalmar Union. Basically, this kick-ass Danish queen united Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Finland, only for her heir to duck it all up. The abuse of Nanking in 1937. Looking up photos of what the Japanese did there left me silent for a while. They raped and murdered women, bayoneted babies. You can look up a photo of it, used the wounded as rifle and bayonet practice, forced mothers on their sons and fathers on their daughters, and made a contest out of beheading civilians. There is a Japanese newspaper article you can look up about it. It's disgusting, and the worst part about it is that the Japanese government denies most of these acts, along with a lot of other war crimes that they committed afterwards. It always shakes me to my core to know that human beings are capable of doing such horrible things to one another, and smile while doing it. Anne Frank's death at the age of 15, hiding from Nazis, had contracted typhus, couldn't recover from it and left her diary for us. Her last words from her diary: "As I've told you many times, I'm split in two. One side contains my exuberant cheerfulness, my flippancy, my joy in life and, above all, my ability to appreciate the lighter side of things. By that I mean not finding anything wrong with flirtations, a kiss, an embrace, an off-color joke. This side of me is usually lying in wait to ambush the other one, which is much purer, deeper and finer. Os." Irish unmarried moms were sometimes required to live in institutions, raising their own babies until they were adopted. Imagine knowing how cute your kid was, taking care of it, knowing you couldn't keep it. Sometimes they were as old as 2 or 3 when adopted. The movie Philomena dealt with this topic. The Gritty Past is a really good sub for this type of content since it highlights more morbid anecdotes and facts from the past. One that really stands out to me from the subbies, this image of the Filipino zoo girl that was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. She was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her. It's just heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to a child so young. But human zoos were a thing up until as late as 1958. RMS Carpathia's rescue of survivors was the first ship to arrive on the scene when the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank. Every one of the Titanic's 705 survivors were rescued by Carpathia. which made a tremendously heroic effort that night in the North Atlantic. The scene is dramatized in A Night to Remember, the classic film from 1958, and one of the more accurate, especially given the constraints of technology at that time. Harold Cottam, a radio operator on Carpathia, had already gone off duty when the Titanic's distress signals were received. He immediately conveyed the message to Captain Arthur Ostrom, who jumped out of bed and ordered the ship to change course. There's this Tumblr post that summarizes what happened next far better than I could. I had to sit down and stare at a wall for a while when I first read it. Through genealogy, I found an old newspaper reporting an accident that happened. My 4 ex-great-grandmother and grandfather were crossing the river into Maine from Canada when their wagon tipped. He and 5 children survived. My 4 ex-great-grandmother and month-old baby did not. That tugged at my heart. I cannot imagine the devastation he and his children felt as they were moving. There was also a lot of stillborns and a lot of children who never saw past the age of 10. It's quite a sad journey at times. The oldest recorded name for a cat was from ancient Egypt. The cat's name was Nejum, which means sweetie. After the Pearl Harbor attack, at least some men were alive in a pocket of air inside one of the capsized ships. Navy personnel could hear them banging on the hull and trying to signal for help, but there was no way to get at them safely. The water was full of fuel and oil, so blowtorches weren't a workable idea, and there was no way for divers to get into the ship because the damage had rendered the whole thing a death trap of twisted steel. There wasn't even any way to communicate with the trapped men, so the guards at Pearl Harbor had to listen to those calls for help getting weaker and weaker, while inside everyone slowly suffocated. When they hauled the ship up for scrap later, there were 16 notches scratched onto the wall of that compartment, which means at least one casualty of Pearl Harbor lived until the 23rd of December, 1941. This story about Sir Nicholas Winton, who saved over 600 children from the Holocaust. No one knew of his story until 50 years later when his wife found notebooks detailing the 669 kids he helped escape the Nazis. Tibetan monks who spend their lives in solitude are often murdered as their deep sense of self is too unwavering for their local government. Modern history makes me sad. One of the girls in the Donner Party was fed her dead mother and told afterwards. They had an agreement to not feed people their family members, but they had broken off from the camp in an attempt to find rescue. She would randomly burst into tears about it at school years later. The whole story of the Donner Party is so horrible and sad, and it bothers me that it's just used for cannibal jokes. There's no more wolves in Ireland. The torture and murder of Junko Furuta. What they did to her would make the cartels cringe. But the worst part of her sordid case is that all of the people involved in her death were given slaps on the wrist and are roaming the streets of Japan today. Of Junko Furuta. Edit. Thank you to everyone who gave this post awards. I appreciate it very much. Have a nice day. The assassination of Aurelian. So pointless. He could have achieved so much. The burning of the library at Alexandria. The story of Hachika, the dog who waited patiently for his owner 9 years after his death. I'm sure many are familiar with the story because of the movies and the episode of Futurama, Jurassic Park, which was inspired by this story. A story from my great-grandfather who fought in World War I. Soldiers would cease fire to pick up their men's bodies and would have a smoke together, go back to their trenches and start firing again. Neither side of frontline soldiers actually wanted to be there, just drafted for war. Edit. Thanks for all the upvotes and awards. It doesn't exactly make me cry, but Albert Göring, the staunchly anti-Nazi brother of Hermann Göring, spent the Second World War helping Jews and dissidents to escape. He was caught several times, but was let off the hook due to his brother's influence within the Reich. After the war, he was shunned for his last name and his accomplishments forgotten. The kneel down of Willy Brandt, German Chancellor of 1969 to 1974. He was visiting the ghetto of Warsaw and kneeled to apologize for the German war crimes, surprising everybody. The thing that really gets to me was the backstory. Brandt emigrated Germany in 1934 for being a social democrat and for having been in the resistance. He spent his time in Oslo until he was captured by Nazi soldiers there and was able to flee to Sweden. The press releases of the time really capture the strength of the moment, and I'm sorry for my translation. This is what Hermann Skrieber wrote in Der Spiegel. Aus dan Niter, der das nicht natig hat, da erfahrung, die es natig haben, aber nicht danino so weil sie es nicht wagen oder nicht können oder nicht wagen können. Dan bekennt sich zu einer Schuld, und der selber nicht zu tragen hat, und bittet Vergebung, der selber nicht bedarf. Dan Niter darf Deutschland, there he kneels. P. Who does not have to, for those who would have to, but who are not kneeling, because they cannot, or because they do not dare to, or because they cannot dare to kneel. There he admits to a guilt. He does not have to bear and asks for a forgiveness he does not need. There he is, kneeling for Germany. We all know the Thanksgiving story in Massachusetts, where the Wampanoag leader Massasoit entered into a peaceful alliance with Plymouth colonists. That peace was broken within a generation. Massasoit's son, Philip, was killed in the subsequent war. Philip's head was mounted on a pike at the entrance to Fort Plymouth, where it stood for several decades. Philip's wife and children were captured and sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Native American history is filled with stories of heartbreak and resilience, both of which frequently produce tears when hearing the stories. I find acts of heroic sacrifice makes me much more emotional than acts of evil and suffering. The latter is so common in the headlines that I've become desensitized to them. The Holocaust. Just unimaginably evil and senseless. On a smaller scale, there's Aberfan, an entire school full of kids in a Welsh village that were wiped out by an unsecured slag pile that slid down a mountain. The fact so many people on the Titanic died purely because they were poor, unable to escape the lower decks, and those who did couldn't get onto the half-empty lifeboats because the rich saved themselves first. Slavery has existed and still exists. The Tulsa Race Massacre. So many tragedies listed maybe on a greater scale, but this was only 100 years ago, and criminally disregarded from the history books. The end of a Sappho poem. Beyond all hope, I prayed those timeless days we spent might be made twice as long. I prayed one word, I want. Someone, I tell you, will remember us, even in another time. That quote always makes me tear up. The treatment of children, in particular, by Joseph Mengele at the concentration camps during World War II, ducking brutal, and now that I have kids of my own, it tears me up anytime I hear about it. The murders of the Romanov family. I've been interested in the Romanov family for years, but what makes me so upset about these murders is that it took longer to kill the children than the parents. The children were shot multiple times and basically bludgeoned, all while still conscious until they died of blunt force trauma. They spent their last minutes of life clinging onto one another as they were heartlessly executed. Breaks my heart. Virginia Woolf's suicide and the note she left behind makes me ducking weep like a baby. Just the way she expresses sentiments of happiness and love to her husband, but also her guilt and struggle with mental illness, it just kills me. During World War II, the Japanese army had comfort stations which served as prisons for women who were taken against their will. They would routinely form lines to take turn in raping and torturing the women trapped in these prison cells. This is just one of Japan's horrid actions during the war. Unit 731 and the Nanjing Massacre are other examples. Pictures of a box of wedding rings taken from the corpses of Jewish people in concentration camps. It just makes me so sad that the only remembrance of their spouse, who could be dead for all they know, is stolen from them and they are unceremoniously buried without their ring. Then the rings are carelessly stored in a wooden box to be melted down. Anime Aquash, native woman who was involved with the American Indian Movement, AIM, was shot in the back of the head execution style. The investigation around her murder was shady and involved the FBI cutting off her hands with the premise that her corpse needed to be fingerprinted. I first learned about her in the first pages of Lakota Woman, a memoir by Mary Bravebird, who was one of her closest friends and who wrote about the murder and how the FBI cut off her hands. I have not been able to stop thinking about Anna's dismembered hands since I read it. Mary also wrote about the involuntary sterilization of Native women in her community, which was widespread through at least the 1970s. The disembodiment and disrespect of Native women haunts me and will haunt me for the rest of my life, especially as a woman and a Native descendant. Somewhere around 20-50 million Chinese people died in an almost entirely man-made famine. Also, if even portions of the claims are true, Elizabeth Bathory's crimes are beyond horrifying and make basically every known serial killer since look almost tame in comparison. I went to a Holocaust museum a few years back for the first time and it absolutely broke me. The pictures of the children who were experimented on are still engraved in my mind. I was emotionally devastated for a long time. The Radium Girls trying to make an honest living. No one higher up cared what happened or took responsibility. Genocide of Srebrenica in 1995. The entire world, apart from poor powerless UN soldiers, looked away as thousands of civilians were executed. In general, I can't believe how much evil and cruelty took place in former Yugoslavia not that long ago. The fact that Anne Frank died just 2 weeks before the camps were liberated. Every time I read her diary, other books about it, I get this weird sense of hope for her, even though I know it's crazy, because of the timing. Almost a quarter of Europe's military-age males died in World War I. The total number of deaths includes from 9 to 11 million military personnel. The civilian death toll was about 6 to 13 million. The casualties in individual battles were insane. For example, 306,000 people died at the Battle of Verdun over the course of 1916. At the Battle of the Somme, almost 1 million were wounded or killed. The Sandy Hook shooting. There have been so many mass shootings that it's easy to become desensitized. But I remember crying when I heard about that one when I thought about what the children went through. The killing fields in the tree. The Red Khmer used to kill infants and small children by smashing them against it. One of the most haunting things I've ever read about. That even babies weren't spared during the Nanking massacre. Dangerfield Newby, one of the 3 black men who died in the raid on Harper's Ferry, had a letter from his enslaved wife on his person. He had been working to buy her and his children, but her owner kept raising the price. JFK's sister Rosemary Kennedy had seizures and mood swings when she was young. Her father Joseph Kennedy decided to lobotomize her in 1941 at 23 years old. She was left severely disabled and unable to speak after the procedure for the rest of her life till she died in 2005 at 86 years old. You can read her diaries she wrote before the lobotomy in the 1930s, where she talks about her full life of going to operas and other social gatherings, meeting the Pope and visiting the White House. She also wrote about her aspirations in social welfare work and performing on stage. It always makes me so sad when I think about her and her life that was stolen from her because of her parents trying to avoid embarrassment. The last words of the Opportunity rover before it was lost to a sandstorm. 14 years into a 3-month mission, in which it explored more of an alien planet than anything of earthly descent, were basically my battery is low. It's getting dark. There was a World War II dude who played the trumpet. One day he was told to stop cause there was a sniper hiding in the mountains who'd totally duck him up if he heard the sound. Guy did it anyway, but he instead played the popular love song 18 years old Germans listened to. Wasn't shot. Next day sniper is captured and he asked who played the song. The guy says I did and you didn't shoot me? Kid was a scared 18 years old. Said he wasn't gonna shoot the man who played the song, him and his GF. The girl he missed listened to back at home. It was their song as a couple. He didn't know what he was fighting for. He wasn't evil. He just wanted to be at home with his GF, but here he is at war with a man he doesn't hate. That we killed all the buffalo out of sport. There used to be millions. Then there were 300. They were a huge part of the North American ecosystem.